Thank you. I always like to get the applause in first because afterwards it might not be so enthusiastic. Thank you for coming, and thank you, Cork PSC, for inviting me. Just a little about my background. I was brought up in an Orthodox religious Zionist family. My father was a rabbi, and I grew up with all the myths about Israel as a democratic state, an island of socialism even. Within the Middle Eastern capitalism, the kibbutzim were held up as a paragon of virtue, and we were told that the Arab refugee problem, they were never Palestinians, that word was never uttered, was because they had been ordered out of Palestine by the Arab regimes in order that they could invade on May the 15th, 1948. The Nakba, of course, was not part of the vocabulary. Some of you, I think, attended Rashid Khalidi's lecture last night, and Rashid Khalidi was the first scholar to actually look at the broadcasts from the Arab radio stations and the CIA and the BBC, and he found that not only were there no orders to the Palestinians to exit, on the contrary, they were told to stay put where they were. But these myths gained ground, of course, and they were fed and they were sustained, and a whole myth of narratives grew up around it, and that is how Israel justified its existence. But in the past, I mean, Israel had and was seen as some kind of shining light. I think today that kind of moral righteousness has been stripped from it. People can see very clearly that it is a genocidal state. The West, the United States in particular, but Britain and Europe, have completely disregarded international law. It's as if the whole legal architecture that was erected after World War II has simply disappeared. The ICC, which had no hesitation in issuing arrest warrants against Vladimir Putin, is still hesitating about issuing them against Netanyahu and Gallant, despite the overwhelming evidence. And we understand why. With Trump coming into power, he sanctioned, I think, the ICC last time, so they will be doubly afraid. So we've seen, in the sense, the collapse of what passed for international law as regards Israel. Israel is supported not because it's a Jewish state, whatever that means. It's supported because the United States and Western imperialism sees it as in its interest to have a watchdog, an armed watchdog, that can impose its will in the Middle East, an oil-rich area, a very strategically important area, and I think we should bear that in mind. Now, having said all of that, I then want to proceed, really. There's a lot of confusion about what Zionism is. For many people, Zionism is something Jewish. And most people don't realise that the antecedents of Jewish Zionism today were in Christian Zionism, which predated Jewish Zionism by about 4 centuries. It was a product of the Renaissance, the Reformation, and so on. It was a Protestant theology that held that the Jews in Europe should return to somewhere they'd never been, which was Palestine, whereas the Catholics, who I suspect most people here are born into the Catholic religion, always held that it was their followers who were the direct successors of the children of Israel. So there was a very sharp, if you like, theological division between Catholicism and Protestantism, which was really, of course, the religion of capitalism and colonialism. And you see that today. The most avid Zionists are Christian Zionists, Christians United for Israel in America, has over 1 million supporters. The Republican right are the most enthusiastic supporters of Israel because they know what Israel represents. And that really is simply a fact. So Christian Zionism predated in theological terms, and then in the 19th century you had people like Lord Shaftesbury and Palmerston, who was the British Prime Minister, trying to persuade the border deputies of British Jews that the Jews should return. And the border deputies refused. In 1838, they established a British consulate in Jerusalem, which was headed by a man named William Young, who was the protector of the Jews. 1840, Shaftesbury approached the border deputies about supporting the return of Jews to Palestine. In 1842, the border deputies issued a clear statement that they had no interest whatsoever in such a concept, and that was echoed by the Pittsburgh Declaration in 1885 of American Reform Jews and similar gatherings. And that was the reason was quite simple, that Jews in Britain wanted to establish their rights of equality here. They were fighting for Jewish emancipation, which came in 1858 in Britain. They certainly weren't interested in an ideology and movement which said they weren't really part of Britain anyway, and their place was elsewhere. They didn't accept, and Reform Judaism in particular didn't accept, that Jews were a nation apart. And that persisted for a very, very long time. Many of you might have heard of the Balfour Declaration of 1917, which was the formal alliance between British imperialism on the one hand and the Zionist movement on the other. It was signed off by the Lloyd George War Cabinet. The only member of that cabinet to oppose it was its only Jewish member, Sir Edwin Montagu, who accused his fellows of anti-Semitism for supporting Zionism, because Zionism was seen as a form of Jewish anti-Semitism. And the reasons for that were very simple. If you wanted to get rid of the Jews, and Zionism was a very good way of doing so. So most anti-Semites tend to be Zionists for very good reasons. And in fact, Richard Spencer, who organised the Charlottesville rally of neo-Nazis, if you remember, under the last Trump administration, who marched in Charlottesville to the slogan that the Jews will not replace us. They have a theory that Jews are trying to replace white Europeans and Americans with Muslims. Richard Spencer has declared openly he's a white Zionist, and that's true. I mean, there is nothing about Israel that if you're a white supremacist or a racist or a neo-Nazi, that there is not to admire, because it's based on the very same principles as them. Ethno-nationalism. And ethno-nationalism, by definition, is racist. A Jewish state must be racist, because if you base the rights and privileges of anyone in a state on their religious adherence, then it makes sense that someone not of that religion will not have those privileges. So during the Second World War, in the Nazi-occupied countries, the most enthusiastic participants in the Holocaust of Jews were the Christian ethno-nationalist states of Romania, of Slovakia and Croatia. Slovakia was the first state to deport its Jews and asked the Nazis to take them off their hands, which they did. Croatia was the only state in Nazi-occupied Europe to have its own extermination camp, mainly for Serbs, but many Jews also died within it. So, I mean, Zionism has, if you like, certain antecedents, but where did Zionism come from? Well, it was a movement amongst what you might call the Jewish petty bourgeoisie, and it was really a direct result of the Odessa pogroms and associated pogroms, which came about as a result of the assassination of Tsar Alexander II in Russia. And Zionism was a minority movement. Like many oppressed people, because Jews then were oppressed, they took on the ideology and the framework of their oppressors. And the anti-Semites said, you don't belong. And the Zionists said, yes, we accept, we don't belong, we are a separate group. I mean, that wasn't unique to Zionism. Marcus Garvey did very much the same in the United States and entered into an alliance with the Ku Klux Klan, amongst others, although that's often forgotten now. So Zionism wasn't unique in that. what was unique in it was that it also saw its salvation in terms of an alliance with one or more imperialist powers. And the founder of political Zionism is a guy called Theodor Herzl. I don't know if any of you have heard of him. He wrote a pamphlet in 1896, it was published, called The Jewish State. And he made very clear what his views were, that the anti-Semites, he wrote in his diaries, the anti-Semites will be our most dependable friends, the anti-Semitic countries will be our allies. Well, that was absolutely true, and that's been true ever since, because there's a congruence of interest, to put it mildly, between Zionism and anti-Semitism. And I have a quote, so I'll flip to where it is. In 1895, in his diaries, Theodor Herzl, 1895, you might remember, was after the conviction of Alfred Dreyfus in France for treason. He was sent to Devil's Island, and there grew up a great campaign around him, which eventually resulted in Dreyfus being freed and then pardoned, and so on. It was a clash, if you like, between the old French, the monarchists, the reactionary clericalists, the army and so on, and if you like, the more modern French bourgeoisie. And the latter triumphed with Dreyfus's rehabilitation. What was Herzl's take on this? Bearing in mind that the myth grew up that Herzl's Zionism was inspired by Dreyfus, but it is simply not true. He wrote in his diaries, I think it's page 6, "In Paris, I achieved a freer attitude towards anti-Semitism, which I now began to understand historically and to pardon. Above all, I recognised the emptiness and futility of trying to combat, inverted commas, anti-Semitism." So just measure those words, the futility and the emptiness of combating anti-Semitism. In other words, Zionism started from the basis that you couldn't fight anti-Semitism. Why? Because it was inherent in every non-Jew. And if it's inherent in them, in their DNA almost, what is the point of fighting it? You obviously have to escape. And that was the starting point for Zionism. And indeed, Zionism really went on from there, not only simply to agree with the anti-Semites that Jews had no place, but they also began to understand that anti-Semitism was in many ways justified. A guy called Jacob Klatskin, who was an important and influential Zionist who edited their magazine Die Welt, and then helped establish the Encyclopedia Hebraica, said if we deny the rightfulness of anti-Semitism, we deny the rightfulness of our own nationalism. In other words, they could see the justness of anti-Semitism itself. And this was called the negation of the diaspora. They began to actually despise the Jewish diaspora as having all the faults and lack of qualities that the anti-Semites said. They were going to create in Palestine what they called the new Jew, the kind of Jewish settler, who wasn't the ghetto Jew of old. And I have a quote from it's an Israeli political scientist, and I'll try and bring it up. His name is Joachim Doron, D-O-R-O-N, and it's in the Journal of Israeli History, so it's a fairly mainstream Israeli academic journal. And he says about the Zionist movement that rather than take up arms against the enemies of the Jews, Zionism attacked the, quote, enemy within, unquote, the diaspora Jew himself, and subjected him to a hail of criticism. Indeed, a perusal of the Zionist sources reveals a wealth of charges against the diaspora Jew, some of which are so scathing that the generation that witnessed Auschwitz has difficulty comprehending them. And I've emphasised that in my book. And this is absolutely true. Pinchas Rosenberg, who was the first Israeli justice minister, described Palestine as an institute for fumigating Jewish vermin, for example, and he wasn't alone in that attitude. So Zionism, despite today it goes on about anti-Semitism. In reality, it's never had any quarrel with genuine anti-Semitism. Of course, if you criticise Israel, then that is anti-Semitic because they redefined anti-Semitism, and they've even brought up a so-called definition called the IHRA in order to justify it, but most of the illustrations of the IHRA relate to Israel, not to anti-Semitism. During the war, because my book, the largest section, is on during the Holocaust. There's a first section of before the Holocaust and another section after, but the main part of it is about during the Holocaust itself. Suffice to say, Zionism during the war was concentrated on one thing and one thing only, which was achievement of Jewish statehood. In fact, it could be said that without Hitler, there may well be no Jewish state. I described in that, 5 years ago, as a talk. I spoke from the floor at the Palestine Expo, and I said that Israel was Hitler's bastard offspring. And the Jewish Chronicle was not particularly enamoured of what I said. So this big headline, Notorious Anti-Semite calls Israel Hitler's bastard offspring. But today, when exterminationist mentality runs rife through Israel, when Israeli podcasters talk about pressing a button and erasing the whole of the Palestinian people, when you have genocidal comments from the Prime Minister downwards, for instance, Yoav Gallant, the former defence minister now, when he opened the war, if that's what you can call it, the war against the Palestinians, he described them as human animals. And if you go to the speech by Heinrich Himmler, who was the head of the SS, which was charged with implementing the final solution, in 1943, October the 4th, 1943, in a talk he gave to senior SS generals, he described Jews as human animals. So exactly the same mentality towards the Palestinians it replicates the Nazi attitude towards Jews. I mean, in many ways, it's quite uncanny, the fact that Zionism and Zionists simply don't appreciate the fact that what they're doing is mimicking. But Israel, if you like, has weaponized the Holocaust, but in a particular way, the way it's constructed its own historiography. So anti-racists and anti-fascists, when they say never again, they mean never again to any people. For the Zionists, never again means never again to Jewish people. It doesn't mean never again as a principle. There are no universal lessons that Zionism draws from the Holocaust in terms of anti-racism and so on. It only draws a conclusion about its own state. It set up an institute called Yad Vashem, which is dedicated to preserving the memory of the Holocaust. But for what reason? It's not in order to ensure it doesn't happen again, that there's no repetition of genocide. On the contrary, Yad Vashem has said not one single word about the current genocide. It's been an institute which has entertained all sorts of neo-Nazis, racists, fascists, you name it, because it's also a diplomatic look, well, in the words of one Israeli academic, Daniel Blattman, it's a diplomatic laundromat to whitewash the various racist criminals that abound in this world. I mean, the first one who visited was John Vorster, who was the Prime Minister of South Africa, if you remember, who was interned during the war because of his pro-Nazi sympathies. But he's not alone. Bolsonaro declared he was a Hitler lover, Rodriguez Duterte of the Philippines, but there are many others as well. So the lessons that Zionism has drawn are very different ones. And I want to quote, and just give me, if I can give this to you to just hold. Yeah, it's from Yehuda Alkner. He was a child survivor of Auschwitz. He was very, very lucky, actually, because children usually were exterminated first off in Auschwitz. But he came on the last train deportation train to Auschwitz, which was left at the back in the siding and was forgotten about. And by that time they were demolishing the gas chambers, so he survived. He was extremely fortunate. But he became rector of the Central European University in Budapest. That is before Netanyahu's anti-Semitic friend Viktor Orban evicted them. And he wrote a very famous article in Haaretz, which is a relatively liberal Israeli language, English language newspaper, the only one incidentally. And he spoke of a profound existential angst fed by a particular interpretation of the lessons of the Holocaust, that we are the eternal victim. In this ancient belief, I see the tragic and paradoxical victory of Hitler. Two nations, metaphorically speaking, emerged from the ashes of Auschwitz. A minority will assert this must never happen again, and a frightened and haunted majority who assert this must never happen to us again. And he went on, but I won't quote any further. I think you get the message that the way Zionism has interpreted the lessons of the Holocaust is such that it can perpetrate another, or in the words of Gideon Levy, who's a journalist on Haaretz, one of the best, one of the very few good journalists in Israel, when he says Gaza, Auschwitz should be a warning to us, but instead Gaza is justified because of Auschwitz. So it's a very similar motive. And what was the record during the Holocaust itself? I said that the aim of Zionism, the goal of Zionism, was to achieve a Jewish state. And during the Second World War, the Zionists really did not want to know about the Holocaust. They didn't even admit to it for a very long time, and then only reluctantly, because they feared that rescue efforts, raising funds for those who were trapped inside Europe, would detract from the major task. The major task was building for a Jewish state, not rescuing the Jews of Europe, who in essence they'd written off. I mean, their only attempts at rescue were really of their own comrades in the Zionist movement inside Europe. And Ben-Gurion came out with a quote, and again I'll just go to it. This was a speech to Mapai, that's the Israeli Labour Party's Central Committee, on the 9th of December 1938. Now, those of you who have some awareness of history might recall that in the previous month there occurred the Nazi pogrom of Kristallnacht, and that had major reverberations throughout Europe. Virtually every synagogue in Germany was burnt down. Jewish shops had their glass smashed, hence the term Kristallnacht, night of broken glass. About 100 Jews were killed, and 30,000 were put in the concentration camps. And the move grew up. People started to realise that the Jews of Germany were in danger of their lives, and the British government offered to take 10,000 Jewish children. And what was David Ben-Gurion's response? Ben-Gurion was the first Prime Minister of Israel and then chair of the Jewish Agency, which was a state in the making. And he said in a speech, if I knew that it would be possible to save all the children in Germany by bringing them over to England, and only half of them by transporting them to Eretz Yisrael, then I would opt for the second alternative, for we must weigh not only the life of these children, but also the history of the people of Israel. In other words, building up the state, the history of the people of Israel, this concept of the ancient people of Israel, which is perpetuated via statehood, was more important to him than saving individual Jewish children's lives. And that was not uncommon. Ben-Gurion, you can read really in the official biography of Ben-Gurion by Shabtai Tabor, The Burning Ground. The last chapter, Disaster Means Strength, and what that means is, that's a quote, is that the disaster of the Holocaust meant strength for the Zionist movement. And Ben-Gurion went on in a memo to the Zionist executive of the 17th of December, about the dilemma Zionism faced, which was that the energy of people trying to rescue Jews would fatally undermine the Zionist movement, whose task was to build the Jewish state. And he said, if the Jews are faced with a choice between a refugee problem and rescuing Jews from concentration camps on the one hand, and aid for the National Museum in Palestine on the other, the Jewish sense of pity will prevail, and our people's entire strength will be directed at aid for the refugees in the various countries. Zionism will vanish from the agenda, and indeed not only world public opinion in England and America, but also from Jewish public opinion. We are risking Zionism's very existence if we allow the refugee problem to be separated from the Palestine problem. And what this meant in practice was they only supported the rescue of Jewish refugees if the destination was Palestine, because they wanted to break open the immigration barriers that the British had imposed with the 1939 White Paper. So you have many examples of where Zionists simply sabotaged and obstructed rescue efforts of others, like Rabbi Dr. Solomon Schonfeld, who was the chief of the Chief Rabbi's Rescue Committee in Britain, because as far as he was concerned, rescue to anywhere was better than dying in Europe. But the Zionists did not see it that way, because in their minds, their rationale was, what is the point of a Jewish state if when the time comes, people are not rescued by it? And even worse, if they go anywhere else, anti-Semitism will reoccur, because anti-Semitism is a product of non-Jewish hostility, so it's futile. It is better to suffer now than forsake the creation of a Jewish state. That was their logic, if you can call it such. So I think really I've really finished much of what I have to say. As I say, Israel, I think, it is clear that the far right are in charge, and to be quite honest, people like Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich, who are two senior cabinet ministers, are really, I wouldn't even say they're neo-Nazis, they're just Jewish Nazis. Their attitude to Arabs, Itamar Ben-Gvir has gone on marches where the slogan is death to the Jew, death to the Arabs, which the slogan in Europe, in Poland and Germany, was death to the Jews. There is really no difference. Their hatred of Arabs goes before it. So Israel, when the West supports Israel, it doesn't do it because of the Jews. It does it because of its own material interests. And I think that's what we have to bear in mind. And the question is how we undermine that support and force our governments into withdrawing their support for genocide at this time. Thank you very much.